Hey everyone, Dr. Liebrecht here with your week 3 video. And I was very pleasantly surprised. I was worried, like, what if not everyone's watching these videos? But I looked at my YouTube channel today and it looks like there's a good number of students in my blended classes watching these videos every week. So, yay, I will keep making them and hopefully I'll find a way to incorporate some of the content from these videos into assignments. That way, just as a sort of reward or a check-in that y'all are doing what you're supposed to. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start our week 3 virtual lecture, focusing on research methods by providing a review and overview. So I'm going to do some housekeeping. I'll do week 2 review and then a chapter 2 overview, followed by exit pass and reminders. Now, I know week 2, I said that in the virtual lectures, I wouldn't really do a lot of new content in this part of our class. And then I would focus on new content in our face-to-face section. But I want to do something where I bring in my own original research since we're focusing on research methods this week. So in order to do that, I wanted to make sure we still got in some new content from the textbook. And so I'm going to incorporate that into our virtual lecture this week. As far as housekeeping, if you have any final questions about the syllabus, our course schedule, assignments, or our eLearn page, make sure you are seeing me before or after our in-person class. You're emailing me, you're asking questions in the exit pass, and or you're attending office hours. I am going to go over the course schedule one more time just because that was specifically discussed in one of the exit passes from week 2 for one of my blended classes. But really, that should be something that I've gone over quite a few times now. And my expectation is that you are paying attention, you're doing what you're supposed to, and you know how to find stuff in our eLearn page. As far as upcoming due dates, discussion 3 is due this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And again, when we go over the course schedule in just a second, you'll see that. The midterm study guide will be on eLearn by Wednesday morning at the latest. So you should have that and you should start working on it. Be prepared to ask me questions during our in-person sessions week 4 so that you can take the midterm during the weekend. It is due on Sunday, week 4 at 11:59 p.m. I'm about halfway done creating the study guide, so I'm actually hopeful that I'll be able to post it early, but I make no promises. Definitely it'll be posted on eLearn by Wednesday morning. Grading updates. I am almost done getting caught up with grading for week 1. Typically, it takes me about a week or so, and so that means I have until Sunday at 11:59 p.m. week 2. Today is Thursday for context, so I will be finalizing the grade book for both of my blended classes on eLearn, hopefully either later today, Thursday, or tomorrow, which is Friday. So a little bit earlier, but that won't always be the case. Don't get used to it. Just know that I grade as quickly as I possibly can. And so you'll see that you should have a score for the pretest out of 5 points. And you should also have a score for your first discussion post. After I have finished reading through all of those, I will likely send a class-wide email providing an overview of feedback because what I've been noticing in my other classes so far is that a lot of the issues were repetitive. And so it is more efficient for me just to send a class-wide email with feedback. But then in the future, I'll give more individualized feedback for you. And then finally, remember, if you have anything you'd like to share with your classmates, feel free to let me know and I will pass that information along, or you can also share at the beginning of class during our in-person sessions. Exit pass updates were pretty consistent between both blended classes. So in a second, I'll go over how to read the course schedule and how to find and submit assignments on eLearn, but make sure you're asking for one-on-one help as needed. I know some folks are less familiar with technology than others, so I don't want to keep belaboring points that the majority of you already understand. If you do need one-on-one help, I'm here to facilitate that. You can either schedule an in-person meeting or a Zoom meeting with me. And then someone mentioned commuting and not having access to a car. So if that's you, please email me as soon as possible because I do take attendance. Attendance does have the potential to have a negative impact on your end of semester grade for our class. So if you cannot show up to our in-person section regularly, then we need to have a conversation about that sooner rather than later. And then pet peeves were also pretty consistent for all my classes. Some of the most common ones were people who chew loudly and people who interrupt. And so, as you continue to get to know each other, and as I start to facilitate more group discussions in our class, make sure that you're being respectful and you are not interrupting each other. I know that some folks struggle with that, especially if perhaps you're ADHD or something like that. And it's okay to be engaging, right? If I'm asking questions during our in person session, or if we're having a more informal class session, but it is a distraction for some folks. It is a pet peeve for others. So make sure that we're being respectful during class conversations and lecture. And then the most relatable for me was someone said their biggest pet peeve is when everyone calls soda pop. And I kind of agree. I like the term soda better. Anyway, all right. Chapter 1 review. Paradigms are philosophical and theoretical frameworks used within a discipline to formulate theories and generalizations. And then we often do experiments to sort of support these theories and generalizations. And this becomes increasingly more important as we dive into research methods because research methods is sort of the experiment part of paradigms. Hypotheses are how we sort of test a theory. So once a theory is developed, we look at, does this theory hold up in different social situations? And so oftentimes the way you write a hypothesis differs based off of what type of data you collect. And last week we talked about how there's sort of two main types of data, qualitative data and quantitative data, and that helps to determine how you write your hypotheses. I'm not going to elaborate anymore because that's going to be the focus for the new content in just a minute. Social solidarity. These are social ties within a group. This is another one of Durkheim's early contributions to the field. And I bring this up because the way that he did his study on suicide and how suicide impacts society and social ties still is relevant for how social scientists collect research to this day. And so that becomes important as we drill into different types of research methodologies for week 3. And then finally, constructivism or social constructs, as I often say. This is just one of those things we really need to review because it will become important throughout the semester. And so this is just the idea that reality is what humans construct it to be. And we as members of society generally agree upon most socially constructed norms. Social constructs can change over time and vary by region, which we talked about quite a bit last week. So I will end things there in terms of the review. As far as new content and chapter 2, one of the things the textbook authors start off with is the scientific method. So this is probably what you remember from like junior high or high school in the natural sciences, but you ask a question. You research existing sources. Typically, this requires reading scholarly journal articles that have been peer reviewed by other social scientists. Then you formulate a hypothesis. So, what do you think is going to happen when you go out and you collect data? Then you design and you conduct a study. You draw conclusions and you report on those results. Oftentimes, this involves publishing your findings, but you might also report to a government agency. For example, if you have a state or a federal grant, then that would be who you report your results to. And so this, in a lot of ways, mirrors the natural sciences as far as how we collect research, and we do follow the scientific method, but our data collection can look a little bit different. And I would argue that quantitative research in the social sciences more closely mirrors the natural science process compared to qualitative methods, but both have pros and cons. And ultimately, the types of research questions you're interested in answering should be what determines if you decide on qualitative or quantitative methodology. All right, moving right along, chapter 2, overviewing quantitative research. So, we already talked last week about the difference between qualitative versus quantitative data. So, qualitative data focuses more on words and analyzing things like interview data or TV shows. Quantitative data focuses more on numbers and statistical analysis. Again, usually social scientists who do that type of research will collect survey data and then they'll analyze that using statistics. Another thing that came up in class is primary versus secondary data. So, primary data is data you personally, as the researcher, collect, versus secondary data is data someone else has already collected that you request access to so that you can analyze that data and draw your own conclusions for publication and reporting purposes. And I believe I mentioned this in both blended classes, but a good example of this is like government data is a really good source of secondary data. You ask the federal government, hey, I need access to this data set, maybe the census data or something like that. The Uniform Crime Report from the FBI is another good source of secondary data. You download that data and then you run statistical analysis to draw your own conclusions. Surveys are where you collect data from subjects who respond to a series of questions about behaviors and opinions, often in the form of a questionnaire, typically using close-ended questions. So questions that don't allow for really flowery, open-ended, long-winded responses, because you want to sort of standardize the responses so that you can do statistical analysis. Again, this most likely is what is happening when folks are doing quantitative research. Population, this is the people who are the focus of a study, such as college athletes, international students, or teenagers living with type 1 diabetes. Oftentimes, when we're doing survey data, when we're doing quantitative projects, you can't survey every single person in a particular population. If you think about a country like the United States, it would be impossible to survey every single person, right? And so oftentimes, social scientists will draw a sample instead. According to your textbook authors, most researchers choose to survey a small sector of the population or a sample. This is a manageable number of subjects who represent a larger population. The sort of gold standard for drawing a sample is called random sampling. This is where every person in a population has the same chance of being chosen for the study. Now, there's other forms of sampling when you start to get into upper division social science classes, especially research methods classes, you'll learn about other strategies for sampling. But for our purposes, as long as you know this stuff here, you should be in good shape for exams and assignments and things like that. As far as qualitative research, again, the most common thing that most folks think about is interview data. This is a one-on-one conversation between the researcher and the subject, typically using open-ended questions. Now, there's different types of interviews you can conduct, including, for example, focus groups, which I'll talk more about potentially during our face-to-face session this week. But for our purposes, as long as you have a basic understanding of what an interview is and what that means in terms of qualitative research, you should be in good shape. Field research refers to gathering primary data from a natural environment, often conducting participant observations. Going out into the field and collecting data. You'll often hear social sciences talk about that. Participant observations is where you join people and you participate in the group's routine activities for the purpose of observing them within that context. I did participant observations for my dissertation study, and you'll often see, especially in the field of anthropology and some other social science fields, that this is very common. You want to be a participant in order to fully understand the people you're observing and what they're doing. Ethnography is being immersed in the natural setting of an entire social community to observe and experience their everyday life and culture. Again, this is very popular in the field of anthropology. Now, your textbook authors focus on a specific type of ethnography that I am particularly fond of called institutional ethnography. And I think this type of ethnography is a little bit unique to the field of sociology. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it during our lecture. So This sort of started out as a feminist perspective for conducting ethnography because often folks who do institutional ethnography focus on the voices and the experiences of women and people who have had historically marginalized identities, like the LGBTQ plus community and people of color. By shedding light on their experiences, things that maybe have been invisible in history and that sort of thing, it allows us to better understand the social world around us and history from a more holistic perspective. One of the other things that's really interesting about institutional ethnography is it's so precise with how you do things. So, one of the things that Dorothy Smith and early institutional ethnographers did is they would follow bureaucracies. They would look at if I want to file a restraining order against someone who has committed an act of domestic violence, from the time I drop off, well, I guess let me backtrack. By the when I go into the police station and I say, I want to file a restraining order, and then I fill out the form and then I put that form onto someone's desk, where does that form go? And from that beginning stage of me going into that office and wanting to file the restraining order all the way to that restraining order into effect. That would be a good example, a sort of classic example of institutional ethnography. And it's meant to provide transparency for how bureaucratic, often government agencies operate. And that's also a good example because people who file restraining orders against a perpetrator of domestic violence tend to be women. So, again, getting the experiences and voices of women and other marginalized folks. And so, oftentimes people get frustrated by bureaucracies and government agencies. And so, that's one of the other reasons why I bring that example up, because if you're interested in learning more about how do bureaucracies operate and why does it feel like it takes a million years for me to get my license renewed, or whatever the case might be, whatever your contact with a bureaucratic government agency might be, institutional ethnography can be a good way to sort of investigate that. And then finally, a case study is an in-depth analysis of a single event, situation, or individual. And again, for our in-person session this week, depending on what you all decide, I might talk about one of my research projects where I conduct a case study and you can sort of get a better understanding of what that looks like in real life. Okay. And then finally, ethical concerns when it comes to research methods. So, value neutrality is a practice of remaining impartial without bias or judgment during a study and in publishing results of the research you collect, the data you collect. But I also pose this question, should we ever not be neutral? So oftentimes in the sciences, there's this desire to be quote unquote unbiased the way that people who conduct research in the natural sciences like biology and chemistry are. However, because we're studying the social world and we all have our unique expertise based off of our identity categories related to things like race, class, and gender, we are experts on certain things and certain experiences. It is okay to allow those expertise to shine when it comes to data collection. And so, while some folks might say, well, as a woman, um, maybe you're not impartial when you research domestic violence and filing a restraining order. But I argue that you're actually more of an expert on the experience of what it means to be a woman. And therefore, you should be the one researching that particular process and that particular experience. And so it's important not to think that someone can't be value neutral just because of the marginalized identities that they may have. And then finally, the American Sociological Association has a code of ethics that our textbook authors talk about during the chapter on research methods. And this just says that we should maintain objectivity and integrity in our research. We should respect subjects' rights to privacy and dignity. We should protect subjects from personal harm. We should preserve confidentiality, seek informed consent, either written or verbally, and protect that informed consent. acknowledge collaboration and assistance, and disclose sources of financial support. So, again, going way back to the beginning of my slides, the example I gave of how reporting might look different if you receive state or federal grant funding. Well, then you would want to disclose that financial support, that source of funding, if you were to then also publish a scholarly journal article from that data you collected. All right. So, in our in person session, this week, week 3, I'm actually going to have you choose your own adventure, so to speak. I would like to bring in my own personal research so that you can see what data collection looks like in real life. It's not as clean cut as people like to think. And I think if you're only reading about research methods from your textbook, it might seem like it's like this really easy, clean, simple thing to do, but it's a lot messier than that. And so I'll let you choose between my MA thesis on parties, schools, and fights on college campuses, or my PhD dissertation where I focus on Title IX and policy on college campuses. So be prepared to choose your own adventure and vote anonymously on which lecture you'd like to see next during our in-person session. And then I will actually present that research to you all. And then once our in-person session is over and I've lectured on one or the other topic, I will post the PowerPoints that go with that talk to our eLearn page after class, which is a little bit different because normally I post our slides before class. Okay, so I just realized as I was talking that I said I was going to do a course schedule overview and a tutorial of how to find stuff on our eLearn page, and I didn't do that, so I'm going to do it now. All right, so if you go to our eLearn page, and I'm going to get into student view. You can go to content, important documents. Here's our syllabus. So if you ever have any questions about what assignments you'll be assessed for, here's that information. And then there's also a little blurb about each assignment type. There's also either a guide or a rubric for each assignment or a study guide for each assignment type. So for discussion posts, there's a rubric. The movies, they have a study guide. The exams have a study guide. And I think that pretty much sums that up. If you haven't already completed your signed class agreement, here's that. Here's our course schedule. So you can see the week is here and the date is here. And then the topic is here. For the most part, the topics align with the stuff you're supposed to be reading. So you can see week 3 is what week we're in, and we're doing research methods. That's chapter 2 in your textbook, which is what you should be reading. Assignments. Again, discussion 3 is due on research methods and annotated bibliography. I just talked about the exam 1 on chapters 1 through 4. That's due week 4. And for the most part, all of the due dates are Sunday at 11:59 p.m. I think the one exception was maybe the signed class agreement, but yeah, for the most part, everything is Sunday. And you can see the due date. I include the date and the time. And all of those assignments should be due on our eLearn page virtually unless otherwise specified or otherwise discussed in class. All right. Signed class agreement. Here's that. Go to assignment. Add a file. You search your computer for that file, you upload it, and then don't forget to hit submit. I know I've had situations in the past at other schools where students, they upload the file and they forget to click submit. If you go back to content, here are our weekly PowerPoints. Here are the weekly virtual videos. And then each week, there's a drop down and you'll find the I guess first I'll say, when you click on the drop down, everything that you should be reading and working toward is here. There's a little checklist. And so if you go to week 3, you'll see that you're supposed to read chapter 2 and review from the previous weeks, focusing on research methods. And the most important thing is usually at the bottom, which is what the assignment that's due. And so complete the discussion on research methods. And so you can sort of click through all those different items. I know it's a little clunky, and actually these things are not loading for me. There we go. And then here's your discussion. You got to go to discussion, and then here is how you post. Now, for my blended classes, because you do have an in-person component each week, you actually don't have to reply. You'll get 5 reply points for participating in some sort of activity or discussion during our in-person class. And so hopefully that shows you how to read our course schedule and how to find assignments and important documents. Important documents is where, important documents is where the midterm study guides will go and things like that. All right, so now I'm gonna go back to our PowerPoint, and I'm just gonna remind you that if you're in the Tuesday class, here's your link for the exit pass. If you're in the Wednesday section, here's the exit pass link. Make sure you're doing those at the end of class during our in-person session. I like to email them to everyone. I know sometimes there's a little bit of a lag, so you can always copy and paste the link here. It's the same link. And I hope that you are downloading the PowerPoints and you are following along during our in-person session so you can take notes. Again, just as far as reminders, make sure you're finishing chapter 3 and starting chapter 4. By the end of this week. So we're focusing on chapter 2 this week for lecture purposes, but you should be starting chapter 3 and finishing chapter 3 and starting chapter 4 in preparation for next week, because next week, by the end of the week on Sunday, you will be taking the midterm exam, and that covers chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. Discussion 3, research methods and annotated bibliography, is due this week, Sunday, by 11:59 p.m. You should start working on your midterm 1 study guide, and I hope you also find time to enjoy your week. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all in your in-person session. Bye, everyone.